They ruled with crowns, scepters, and paranoia, but in death they got weirder. From emperors buried with booby traps to queens entombed behind decoy walls, these royals didn't just plan for the afterlife, they tried to control it. Some vanished without a trace, others demanded eternal drama. One even cursed the world from his grave. Welcome to the most bizarre burial wishes in history, where power, fear, and ego refuse to die quietly. This isn't just about where they're buried. It's about what they were running from. Before we dive into the tombs, traps, and royal theatrics, take a moment to subscribe for more stories that refuse to rest in peace. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Because whether it's midnight in Cairo or noon in Tokyo, these royals are just getting started. Qin Shi Huang. Qin, the first emperor of China, was not content with ruling the living. That was a temporary arrangement, a performance, really. His true ambition was to govern the dead, permanently. Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified a patchwork of warring states into the colossal entity we now call China, spent much of his life not celebrating power, but running from death. He was terrified of it. Obsessed, really. Not in the poetic, skull on the desk, Hamlet sort of way, no. Qin Shi Huang put an entire empire to work in his race against the inevitable. His obsession began early. By the time he declared himself the first emperor at the age of 38, he had already begun construction on his tomb, not a tomb in the conventional sense, but a necropolis. A city of the dead, carved into the earth itself. A 3/8 square mile underground fortress surrounded by trap-filled corridors, spiked pits, and false doors designed to outwit tomb robbers and cosmic forces alike. In this hidden city, he would rule in perpetuity. He commissioned over 700,000 laborers to work on the project. Some were artisans, most were convicts, prisoners of war, and unlucky peasants. Their job was to build a shadow kingdom, a full replication of his empire beneath the soil of Mount Li. Palaces, offices, stables, weapons, caches, even booby-trapped banquet halls. And, of course, soldiers. Not merely statues, soldiers. 8,000 terracotta warriors, each unique, each bearing different armor, hairstyles, and facial expressions. Rank and file, infantry, cavalry, generals, chariots. There were archers frozen mid-pull, horses mid-gallop, entire squads locked in eternal formation. These were not mere funeral decorations, they were a standing army, commissioned for one final war, the afterlife. But what really pushes this from strange to downright apocalyptic is the river. According to ancient sources, mostly the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian Qin Shi Huang's necropolis contains flowing rivers and seas of mercury, engineered to mimic the Yangtze, the Yellow River, and the great oceans of the world. Mercury was the alchemical elixir of life to some Taoist thinkers. To others, it was divine poison. To Qin Shi Huang, it was both protection and passage. Rivers of liquid death, winding through catacombs. The theory seemed ridiculous until modern tests in the 1982nd found abnormally high levels of mercury in the soil above the unexcavated burial mound. Not metaphorical rivers, real ones, toxic, glinting, meandering streams of heavy metal. But the tomb itself remains sealed. It's never been opened. Not for science, not for history, not even for curiosity. Why? Because the very thing that made Qin Shi Huang obsessed with immortality is the same thing that keeps us from disturbing his peace. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of ancient traps. Fear of curses, collapsing tunnels, And yes, mercury poisoning. The Chinese government has officially cited preservation concerns, and maybe that's true. But unofficially, the site remains untouched because some mysteries are too perfect to risk ruining with answers. There's a strange poetry in that. A man who feared death so much that he built a prison to outlive it and now lies entombed in the one place nobody dares dig. But before you laugh at the excess of it all, the mercury rivers, the paranoid booby traps, the ghost army in clay, consider this. Qin Shi Huang ruled for just over a decade. His dynasty collapsed a few years after his death, yet more than 2,000 years later, we're still talking about him, still afraid to open his tomb. In the end, he got what he wanted. And maybe, just maybe, he's not alone down there. Because while Qin Shi Huang might have been the first to turn his burial into a national infrastructure project, he wouldn't be the last royal to try and listen from the grave. High up on a hill in Ethiopia, another emperor thought he'd found a better vantage point. Emperor Menelik II, Ethiopia. If Qin Shi Huang built his tomb to command from below, Emperor Menelik II aimed higher, literally. The man believed in altitude spiritual, moral, and architectural. In the early 1902, after unifying Ethiopia and pushing back the Italian invasion at the Battle of Adwa, one of the only successful African resistances against European colonization, Menelik stood atop a hill overlooking the capital he helped shape, Addis Ababa. It was more than a city. It was his legacy, his monument, his proof to the rest of the world that Ethiopia would not kneel. And yet, despite his fierce resistance to colonial rule and modern medicine alike, he famously tried to treat illnesses with holy water and prayer. He had one very specific, very strange request for his death. He wanted to be buried on the highest hill in the city. But not just any hill, Mount Entoto, a site sacred to Ethiopian orthodoxy, cold and wind-battered, covered in eucalyptus trees. Up there sat the Church of Street. Merely a modest blue-painted church, surrounded by open sky and the whispering echo of wind through pine. His reason? So I can hear the prayers of the people from above. To Menelik, this wasn't metaphorical. He meant it quite literally. In his cosmology, the hill was not just a perch, it was a divine soundstage, a spiritual amplifier, a place where the voices of the living could echo up to him in death, and where he, perhaps, could listen back. He didn't want grandeur, not in the European sense. No gold-encrusted mausoleum, no military parade, no imperial procession to rival the pharaohs. Just elevation, the acoustics of the afterlife. This peculiar wish was granted, though not without complications. Menelik had suffered a series of strokes late in life. For years before his death in 1913, he was unable to speak, reportedly communicating only through gestures and prayers. Even in his silence, he remained politically sacred, a living relic of Ethiopian independence and divine right. And so, when he died, his burial took on a kind of spiritual urgency. His body was transported in solemn procession up Mount Entoto, escorted by clergy, family, and the guarded reverence of a population that saw him not merely as a king but a vessel. Not a man going to God, but a man already part of him. The church itself, Street Mary of Entoto, was small, humble, not the resting place one would expect for a man of such historical weight. But for Menelik, that was precisely the point. It was local, close to the people, geographically elevated but spiritually grounded. Not an imperial tomb in a fortified palace, a chapel above the clouds. And here's the strange part. Though he was interred with full religious ceremony, his exact burial chamber is still a matter of debate. Some say it lies beneath the church floor. Others claim it's hidden behind a sealed wall in a side chapel. There are even persistent rumors, half folklore, half nationalist poetry, that Menelik's body was never really buried at all, but placed inside a hidden stone sarcophagus on the northern slope of the mountain, where only the priests know the way. As with many ancient leaders, the uncertainty around the tomb only strengthens the mythology. To this day, Ethiopian Orthodox pilgrims climb Mount Entoto, not just for worship but to speak. They whisper into the air. Some leave notes folded into the cracks of stone walls. Others sit in silence, believing the emperor still listens. That somewhere beneath the earth, or behind a wall, or above them entirely, Menelik is still hearing the prayers he wanted so desperately not to miss. And there's something quietly haunting about that. A king who fought to keep his people free, still trying, in death, to stay within earshot. But if Menelik wanted to be remembered, Catherine de' Medici wanted something more complex. She wanted to control how she'd be remembered, or rather, not remembered at all, unless the stars aligned. Which they didn't. 2 rulers down, one buried in Mercury rivers, the other on a mountain to hear the prayers of the living, and we're just scratching the surface. If you're into stories that blur the line between power and paranoia, make sure to subscribe. There's a lot more strangeness where that came from. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? Because no matter when or where you're tuning in, these royals are still making noise from the grave. Catherine de' Medici. Catherine de' Medici didn't fear death so much as she feared interpretation, that is, what people would say about her after she was gone. And rightly so. She'd spent most of her life being misread, mistrusted, and mythologized. Born an Italian noblewoman, orphaned young, married off into French royalty, and quickly widowed, Catherine's life had the rhythm of a curse. She became Queen of France almost accidentally, a backup consort who outlived her husband, controlled 3 sons who were too weak or too young to rule alone, and who was constantly accused of pulling strings in the dark. History has painted her as a schemer, a poisoner, a black-clad manipulator, and perhaps most famously, a woman with a fatal obsession with astrology. But astrology was only the tip of the cosmic iceberg. Catherine didn't just read horoscopes. She employed entire teams of astrologers and mystics. Nostradamus himself was among them, and refused to make major life decisions, political alliances, or architectural plans without first consulting the stars. She believed in planetary cycles, in omens, in energies trapped between birth and death. And when it came to her own death, she planned it with a level of paranoia and theatrical precision that would make a modern horror director proud. Catherine chose the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French royalty, for her eternal bed. She insisted on being buried in a specific tomb beside her husband, Henry II, in a carefully chosen spot beneath the basilica's stone ribs. But her real instructions were less about location and more about what not to do. Do not move my body. Do not touch my tomb. Do not disturb me. Over and over, these instructions appear in her personal writings, in royal correspondence, and even in unofficial court rumors. Her will, one of several versions rewritten as her health declined, emphasized finality. She feared dislocation. She wanted her corpse to be left alone, not just for reasons of dignity, but because she believed that disturbing the body disrupted the soul's journey. To Catherine, rest was not a metaphor. It was a fragile spiritual state that could be shattered by curiosity, greed, or revolution. But she knew her reputation. She knew people talked. Even in life, her enemies accused her of staging seances in the Louvre, of sleeping in rooms draped in black, of bathing in special herbal potions to lengthen her life. She was a queen surrounded by myth, and she suspected accurately that death would only make things worse. She was right. When Catherine died in 1589, France was in chaos. Religious civil wars, the wars of religion, had turned the country into a paranoid, blood-soaked mess. Her death wasn't met with mourning. It was met with gossip and mockery. She was buried, yes, in Saint-Denis, as she had asked. But not long after, during the French Revolution, the very idea of monarchy itself became offensive. In 1793, revolutionaries broke into the royal tombs and desecrated them en masse. The bones of kings, queens, and emperors were pulled from their crypts, looted, tossed into mass graves, or outright destroyed. Catherine's remains were no exception. Her carefully chosen tomb was violated. Her body was scattered, her bones jumbled with dozens of others, thrown into a communal pit outside the basilica walls. Her final wish, her single obsessive command, was ignored. And so the irony couldn't be sharper. The woman who feared being moved, misread, and misremembered ended up not only dislocated in death, but eternally reinterpreted. She had tried to engineer her legacy the way she engineered marriages and alliances, strategically, mystically, surgically. But the chaos of history is no respecter of carefully crafted narratives. Now her original tomb lies empty, a hollow monument to a ghost who may not be resting, and who certainly wasn't listened to. And the myth of Catherine grew louder. Some say her spirit haunts the Louvre. Others claim she appears on rainy nights near Saint-Denis, searching for her missing bones. Of course, none of this can be proven. But isn't that exactly what she feared? That she would become just another story? But while Catherine was preoccupied with controlling her memory, the next royal on our list took a far stranger route, trying to fake life itself. A Spanish king, rotting from the inside, who demanded to be displayed after death as if he were still ruling. And no, it didn't go well. King Charles II of Spain. If Catherine de' Medici feared misinterpretation in death, King Charles II of Spain feared irrelevance. That is perhaps the most generous way to explain what he requested for his burial: that his lifeless body be propped up, fully dressed in regal attire, and placed on display as though he were still alive and still ruling. No coffin, no humility, no soft descent into silence. Just a corpse in velvet robes, scepter in hand, and a crown perched atop a lifeless head, staged upright like a political wax figure, a puppet king in death, as he had arguably been in life. It is, on its face, an almost absurd request, but when you understand Charles II, it begins to feel inevitable. Born in 1661 into the crumbling remains of the once mighty Habsburg dynasty, Charles was less a ruler than a tragic symbol. His family tree had more loops than branches. The result of generations of inbreeding, a practice the Habsburgs had refined into an art form, Charles entered the world sickly, physically deformed, and cognitively impaired. He could barely chew food, struggled to speak, and by adulthood had the appearance of a man twice his age. But appearances were everything in royal Europe, and Charles was, despite all, the king, the last male of the Spanish Habsburg line. His rule was marked by paranoia, manipulation, and the quiet orchestration of others, advisors, priests, foreign ambassadors who wielded power in his name while he played the role of monarch in a body increasingly failing him. By the time of his death in 1700, Charles was only 38, but looked closer to 80. His body was deteriorated, ravaged by decades of illness, and yet his final request was not for peace or dignity. It was for performance. He wanted to be dressed in full regalia and displayed standing upright, posed as if in mid-audience, as though greeting diplomats or delivering commands. According to accounts from the Spanish court, he hoped to maintain the dignity of the crown even after death, which sounds noble until you remember that Charles could barely maintain dignity in life. His attendants tried to honor the request. They dressed his decaying body in royal garments heavy with embroidery and gold thread and attempted to stage the scene, but rigor mortis and decomposition had other ideas. His body would not cooperate. The room began to reek. The makeup melted. The king, once barely alive, now refused even to die neatly. It was, in every sense, a disaster. What began as a final gesture of defiant majesty turned into something closer to political farce. The chamber where he was displayed had to be closed off. Attendants fainted. Foreign envoys, already skeptical of Spain's future, took it as a grotesque omen. Some whispered that the body was cursed. Others, that the king's spirit was trapped in his own decaying form, unable to let go of the throne he never really owned. And here lies the unsettling truth beneath the absurdity. Charles II's entire life was a performance of kingship. From the moment of his birth, he was treated not as a child, but as a fragile relic of legitimacy, proof that the Habsburgs still ruled by divine right. He was never meant to be questioned, only displayed. So of course, when the end came, he asked to be displayed again. One final time. A ruler in life. A mannequin in death. But even in this, Charles failed to secure his legacy. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal, continent-spanning conflict over who would replace him. His carefully staged funeral could not distract from the political vacuum he left behind. His corpse, like his reign, was ultimately cleaned up, hidden away, and rewritten to suit the needs of others. And in a strange, poetic turn, he became exactly what he had feared, irrelevant. Still, there's a lesson in Charles's theatrical exit. When power becomes appearance, death becomes its final stage. And for some rulers, that performance matters more than rest, peace, or even biology. Which brings us to a king whose body carried a curse. A man who, unlike Charles, expected his tomb to be violated and wrote a warning that would echo through history. A conqueror who dared anyone to disturb him and may have unleashed something far worse when they did. Tamerlane. Timur, Central Asia. Tamerlane or Timur, depending on which century or empire you ask, was not a man who did things by halves. He didn't conquer cities, he leveled them. He didn't defeat armies, he annihilated them. He didn't just rule Central Asia, he imagined himself as the resurrection of Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, and every other world shaker who had left their name in blood across a map. But for all the brutality and bravado, Timur's most enduring power play came long after his death. He left behind a warning, not a metaphorical one, not a vague, here lies so-and-so, fear the wrath of history type of epitaph. No, Timur's tomb, built beneath the cobalt dome of the Gur-e-Amir mausoleum in Samarkand, carried a very literal curse, one that would seem laughable if not for what happened next. Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I. There it was, simple, chiseled, a threat aimed squarely at the future. Of course, Timur was no fool. He knew his tomb would be tempting. His reputation as a ruthless warlord who claimed descent from Genghis Khan, fought campaigns from Delhi to Damascus, and piled the skulls of his enemies into architectural monuments, made his grave both sacred and scandalous. He was a man whose legacy demanded to be disturbed, and he knew it. That's why the mausoleum wasn't just beautiful, it was fortified. The tomb itself lay far below the ornamental surface. It was sealed, disguised, and surrounded by false chambers designed to mislead. Timur's body was entombed in an unmarked sarcophagus carved from solid jade, massive, dark green, and far heavier than it looked. Legend claimed it could not be moved without consequence, or, at the very least, without effort. And so it remained undisturbed for over 500 years. Until 1941, enter the Soviet Union. In a time where religious sites were converted into storage depots and superstition was crushed beneath the boot of official atheism, the idea of respecting a centuries-old curse didn't exactly hold water. Stalin's regime gave the green light for a team of Soviet anthropologists, led by Mikhail Gerasimov, to exhume Tamerlane's remains as part of a broader ethnographic study. It was scientific, rational, historical. And on the 20th of June, 1941, the tomb was opened. Accounts from the team are remarkably consistent. They described a sudden shift in the air, a dry wind that blew through the mausoleum, despite the absence of any breeze. Some locals begged them to stop, warning of the inscription. The workers laughed. Scientists don't believe in curses. They found the jade sarcophagus, opened it, and uncovered the remains of a tall, broad-shouldered man, exactly as chroniclers had described Timur. His right leg was shorter than his left, just as the histories said. His facial reconstruction would later confirm his proud, angular features. It should have been a triumph of anthropology. But 2 days later, on the 22nd of June, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of warfare. Nazi Germany tore into Soviet territory with nearly 4 million soldiers. Cities were incinerated, civilians slaughtered. The Soviet Union plunged into chaos. It was a disaster Stalin hadn't seen coming, one that would cost tens of millions of lives. And suddenly, Timur's curse didn't seem quite so funny. The link may have been coincidence, but try telling that to the people of Samarkand, who had begged the Soviets not to open the tomb, or to the researchers, who according to later reports became increasingly uneasy as the war escalated. Some even pleaded with Moscow to rebury Timur's remains. In 1942, during the Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point of the war, the Soviet government finally gave in. Timur's remains were reinterred in the Gur-e-Amir with full Islamic burial rites. Military honor guards were present. The tomb was resealed. 2 weeks later, the Red Army began pushing the Nazis back. Now, was this cause and effect, or just the human need to make patterns out of horror? A warlord's curse is, after all, a tidy narrative, easier to swallow than geopolitics and industrialized death. But whether real or not, the legend of Timur's warning has outlived every general who's ever tried to ignore it. Because some tombs don't just house bones, they house intent. And while Timur's threat was loud, blunt, and backed by centuries of myth, our next emperor took a quieter approach, booby-trapping his own grave not for grandeur or prophecy, but for paranoia. After all, when you rule by fear, you tend to die expecting revenge. Emperor Justinian II, Byzantine Empire. In the long, paranoid corridors of Byzantine history, few figures loom as grotesquely unforgettable as Justinian II, a man whose burial instructions read less like a royal will and more like a manual for a haunted house. You don't get nicknamed Rhinote Meadows, literally, the slit-nosed, and walk away with a normal relationship to death. Or trust, or anything, really. Justinian II ruled the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, not once, but twice. His first reign began in 685 CE, and it was a rough ride from the start. Charismatic, ambitious, and arguably brilliant, Justinian was also notoriously cruel, vindictive, and pathologically suspicious. He taxed his people to the bone, offended the aristocracy, and exiled or executed anyone who so much as raised an eyebrow in his direction. Unsurprisingly, this led to a coup in 695. He was deposed, exiled, and here's the detail that changes everything: had his nose publicly cut off. Why the nose? Because in Byzantine tradition, a mutilated body was considered unfit to rule. It was an old superstition, a theological interpretation of the imperial body as symbolic of divine perfection. The idea was simple: no nose, no throne. But Justinian II didn't get the memo, or, more accurately, he refused to accept the terms of his removal. 10 years later, with a prosthetic golden nose welded to his face, Justinian marched back into Constantinople at the head of a foreign army, burned his enemies alive, and reclaimed the throne in a cloud of smoke, gold, and vengeance. His second reign made the first look like a warm-up. Where most rulers mellow with time, Justinian hardened. He ruled with even more suspicion, obsessed with plots, omens, and celestial signs. He executed old allies, razed cities that had welcomed his enemies, and took Byzantine brutality to operatic levels. The empire, barely functioning, groaned under the weight of his need for retribution. So when death finally approached in 711 at the hands of yet another rebellion, Justinian didn't go quietly. According to multiple chronicles, he had long anticipated a violent end, but even more than death itself, what terrified him was what would happen after. Desecration. Not just looting, not just being forgotten. Justinian feared his enemies. Political, spiritual, perhaps even cosmic would attempt to dig him up, humiliate his corpse, scatter his bones, or worse, turn him into a martyr for their own ends. And so, long before his death, he commissioned the construction of a burial site designed like a military trap. It was a tomb with no grace, no serenity, a place not of peace, but of warning. Descriptions of its interior vary, but Byzantine records and later legends agree on the core details. The tomb was rigged with mechanical defenses, stone spikes hidden in walls, concealed pressure plates meant to collapse ceilings, false doors leading to locked cells. The sarcophagus itself was rumored to be sealed with poisoned mechanisms, triggered by forced entry. Some chroniclers speak of embedded curse tablets, long coiled ribbons of lead, inscribed with maledictions against those who dared disturb the emperor's remains. Justinian had essentially turned his grave into a posthumous revenge plot. And it wasn't just the architecture, the psychological trap was just as intricate. He instructed priests to perform a special version of the anathematization rite, a ritual cursing of any soul who would tamper with the dead. It wasn't just spiritual insurance, it was theatrical, dramatic, almost performative. A king cursing the air he would no longer breathe, just to make sure it still obeyed him. Historians still debate whether the tomb was ever actually booby-trapped, or whether it was all elaborate myth-making. But the point was never really about function. It was about deterrence. Justinian wanted the world to know, you can kill me, but you will never rest easy afterward. And perhaps that's the clearest window into his mind. Justinian II believed in power that outlived flesh, not spiritual transcendence, control. Even in decay, he wanted to dominate the narrative, to grip the living world with the cold fingers of a rigged sarcophagus. He was buried, eventually where exactly remains a mystery. Some believe his body was dumped in an anonymous grave after his final overthrow. Others claim his loyalists smuggled him into a hidden crypt where his traps remain quietly set, waiting for a curiosity brave or foolish enough to test them. But even if his tomb was never triggered, the idea of it lingers. A death so haunted by vengeance that it had to be designed like a prison, not to hold a body, but to lock in the rage. And while Justinian's afterlife was about revenge, the next emperor imagined something grander. A burial that was also a puzzle, a maze, and a cosmic joke designed to confuse thieves, honor the heavens, and hide treasure deep behind riddles of stone. Emperor Akbar, the Great, India. In a world of kings who feared being forgotten, Akbar the Great did something unusual. He buried himself before he died. Not literally. Of course, that would have made the Mughal court meetings uncomfortably quiet, but in spirit, planning, and architecture, Akbar began preparing his tomb years before death ever came knocking. In fact, the great emperor personally chose the site, sketched out the structure, and oversaw the early stages of construction himself. It wasn't a cry for immortality. It was a test of thieves, of time, and of the afterlife itself. Akbar ruled India from 1556 to 1605, a reign so influential that even his enemies begrudgingly acknowledged his genius. He expanded the Mughal Empire through diplomacy as much as war, built alliances with Hindu rajas, dabbled in comparative theology, hosted salons of mystics and philosophers, and constructed monuments that seemed to rise more from poetry than from stone. But Akbar's relationship with death was complicated. He didn't fear it, he studied it. He wanted to understand what came next. A Sufi at heart, but a skeptic in method, Akbar flirted with every religion under his sunlit empire. Islam, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, even atheism, in quiet moments. His court was a cathedral of contradictions, and so, when it came time to plan his own tomb, he didn't seek comfort. He designed a labyrinth. The result is Sikandra, a sprawling red sandstone complex located just outside Agra. From a distance, it looks like a palace turned inside out. Domed gates, geometric gardens, Persian inscriptions etched in marble. It is symmetrical and serene until you begin to notice the tricks. The tomb has 5 levels, each with corridors, chambers, and courtyards arranged like concentric puzzles. But here's the genius. Only one door actually leads to the burial chamber. The other entrances are fakes, dead ends, decoys, and traps for both grave robbers and, perhaps, wandering spirits. In Akbar's design, the real tomb isn't even in the grandest hall. It's not raised on a pedestal or placed in the central axis like a trophy. It's hidden, buried beneath an unmarked slab in a modest room deep within the lowest level, quiet, dim, and undecorated. You could walk past it and never realize it was the final resting place of a man who ruled half a continent. This wasn't humility, it was strategy. Akbar knew what happened to royal graves. India was no stranger to looted tombs, desecrated mausoleums, and whispered curses that echoed off cracked marble. He built fake doors to confuse intruders. And it worked. Several invaders later plundered Sikandra, but failed to locate the real chamber. Some looted empty sarcophagi. Others got lost in the inner courtyards. One colonial officer allegedly declared it a monument to geometry, not death. But the most chilling rumor? That Akbar didn't just rely on architecture. According to several Mughal chroniclers, including the semi-legendary Abdul Fazl, his court historian Akbar ordered living guards to be buried alive within the tomb's lower levels. Loyal soldiers, volunteers, supposedly. Men sworn to protect their emperor beyond death. Their task was not symbolic. They were to remain hidden in concealed niches and sealed rooms, emerging only if intruders breached the inner sanctum. If the stories are to be believed, some even had access to hidden weapon caches and collapsing corridors. There is no official proof of this. No excavation has revealed skeletons in uniform, and yet the legend persists. Because it fits. Akbar's tomb was never just a grave. It was a philosophy lesson, a riddle disguised as a building, a message to future generations that power can be buried but it doesn't have to die. That identity, like truth, is always a bit obscured, even for the man who commissioned it. Perhaps that's why Sikandra feels so strange. It's not solemn, it's curious. You walk through it not to mourn, but to search for doors, for meaning, for the right path through the wrong ones. And this much is certain. Akbar wanted you to search. He made death a puzzle on purpose. But where Akbar used deception to protect what he loved, the next royal turned his own burial into a final act of theatrical defiance. A man who worshipped beauty, detested daylight, and demanded to be buried by candlelight in the shadows of a pageant he directed from beyond the grave. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. King Ludwig II didn't die. He exited stage left into legend. A romantic recluse, an architectural obsessive, a patron of Wagnerian opera and fantasy on an imperial scale, Ludwig II was the kind of monarch who seemed allergic to reality. And when it came to death, he didn't face it. He choreographed it. Known to history as the fairy tale king, Ludwig ruled Bavaria from 1864 to 1886. His reign was defined not by wars or laws or even politics, which he largely ignored, but by visions, dreams, castles, swans, elaborate pageantry drawn from the Germanic myths he adored. His imagination had a higher GDP than his kingdom, and he poured it into a personal empire of marble, moonlight, and solitude. But Ludwig wasn't merely eccentric, he was deliberate. Take Neuschwanstein Castle, the crown jewel of his architectural fever dream. Perched high in the Bavarian Alps, surrounded by fog and folklore, it looks like something Disney would eventually copy, and they did. He never even finished it, never lived in it. It wasn't meant to house people. It was built for an ideal, a kind of devotional temple to myth, music, and melancholy. And that's how Ludwig lived. Not in the world, but in the world as he wished it could be. But even the most elaborate fantasy has an expiration date. As his spending ballooned and his isolation grew deeper, Ludwig's ministers became increasingly uneasy. By 1886, they had him declared mentally unfit to rule a move that may have been politically motivated, but was entirely believable. Ludwig barely spoke to anyone, communicated with his ministers by written notes, and had begun sleeping all day and riding through his gardens at night by torchlight, wearing medieval garb. He was, in every sense, a man out of time. Just days after being deposed, Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg, under what can only be described as suspicious circumstances. The official report claimed drowning. Unofficial theories range from assassination to suicide to escape, but the death, like the life, was unresolved more poetry than history. And Ludwig must have known it would end like that. He planned for it. His burial was not an afterthought, it was his final production. He demanded to be buried at night, in total secrecy, with a single candle-lit procession through the streets of Munich. No fanfare, no state funeral, no sunlit ceremonies. He wanted moonlight, silence, mystery. Witnesses few, and sworn to discretion, reported that the candle-bearers were dressed in black. No horses, no public announcements, just a quiet movement of shadows across cobblestones as if the city itself was being put to bed. His coffin, heavy and adorned in understated silver, was placed in the Wittelsbach family crypt beneath street, Michael's church, without a viewing or final blessing. Even in death, Ludwig demanded control of the narrative. But here's where it gets stranger. He left behind notes, not an official will, but instructions vague, poetic, and laced with Wagnerian references about his burial. They spoke of eternal twilight, of sacred stillness, of the soul's return to the mythic realm. No practical instructions, just tone, vibe, stage direction, the kind of thing you'd expect from a composer, not a king. And then there was the alleged death mask, a plaster cast made of his face after death, which was later found in private family archives. In it, his features appear serene, but faintly amused, almost as if he's in on the joke, as if death was simply the next act in a story no one else had caught up to. Ludwig's tomb remains sealed, and unlike so many royal burials, it has never been looted, relocated, or revised. Tourists still visit street Michael's, but few realize that beneath the church floor lies the remains of a man who built castles for swans, wrote letters to kings who never answered, and staged his own death like a lost opera. He never married, left no heirs, created no lasting policies, but left behind more wonder than most empires. In the end, Ludwig's grave is less a resting place than a final curtain call. And speaking of royal women who dared to write their own ending, the next monarch on our journey was not just a queen, but a sultan. A woman who ruled alone, against centuries of tradition, and built a tomb not just for memory, but for defense. Shajar al-Durr, Egypt. In the long, fractious history of Egypt's rulers, pharaohs, caliphs, sultans, kings, one name breaks the pattern like a blade through silk: Shajar al-Durr. A woman, a sultan, a widow turned warrior queen, and finally, a ghost with a mausoleum designed like a secret, half mosque, half fortress, an eternal riddle written in marble and shadow. She didn't just rule. She disrupted. Shajar al-Durr, whose name poetically translates to Tree of Pearls, was born neither royal nor powerful. Likely of Turkic origin, she entered the court of Egypt as a slave concubine in the Ayyubid dynasty, rose in influence, and married Sultan as-Salih Ayyub. When he died in the midst of a Crusader invasion in 1249, chaos threatened to swallow Cairo. But Shajar, quiet and calculating, acted faster than history expected. She hid the Sultan's death from the army, signing decrees in his name, keeping the morale steady while summoning her allies. And then when the time was right, she made her move. She revealed the truth, took control of the court, coordinated the defense, and orchestrated the defeat and capture of King Louis IX of France at the Battle of Mansoura. Let's repeat that. A female former slave captured a king of France. When her political enemies hesitated, she simply declared herself Sultan of Egypt, not queen consort, not regent, not puppet. Sultan, the only woman in Islamic history to rule Egypt in her own name. Of course, that didn't sit well with the ulama or the Mamluk generals or anyone whose worldview required a man on the throne. Her reign was short, less than 3 months officially, but its aftershocks would be felt for centuries. She was removed from power, then later implicated in a conspiracy and executed, possibly beaten to death by sandalwood clogs in a bathhouse, though details remain shadowed by rumour and contradiction. But what came after her death may be even more mysterious than the coup that brought it. Before her fall, Shajar al-Durr commissioned her own tomb, and like everything else in her life, it walked a tightrope between reverence and rebellion. Located in Cairo, just outside the citadel, the mausoleum stands today with quiet, almost defiant grace. It doesn't shout, it doesn't tower, but it refuses to be ignored. At first glance, it appears like a modest domed structure, a funerary complex of ordinary Ayyubid design, but step closer, and the details start whispering. Imported marble from distant lands, rare, costly, and politically provocative, carvings that blend Islamic motifs with subtle Christian and even Byzantine influences. Inscriptions in graceful Kufic script, carefully chiseled not only to honor God, but to place Shajar herself alongside the martyrs and saints. Her name appears not merely as a benefactor, but as a ruler, a rightful sultan in a city that tried to erase her claim. And then there's the architecture itself, a tomb with secrets. Historians and archaeologists have long debated the structure's unusual layout. Hidden passages, sealed chambers, odd asymmetries. Some believe these were defensive measures, protection against grave robbers, vengeful successors, or political enemies seeking posthumous humiliation. Others see them as symbolic, a kind of mystical geometry, referencing Sufi cosmology and the path of the soul through veils of illusion. Either way, the message is clear. Shajar didn't want to be found easily, not in death, not in memory. Some accounts suggest that parts of her tomb were relocated or modified over timepieces stolen, other parts sealed off. Her exact burial location within the complex is still debated. Visitors today walk through the cool stone halls of the mausoleum without knowing if they're standing above her or merely near her. It's a spatial metaphor for her place in history. Central, yet displaced. Visible, yet obscured. Even the decorative motifs echo her paradox. Delicate floral patterns entwined with sharp geometric lines, feminine softness layered over rigid symmetry. A visual language of contradictions like a crown made of barbed silk. And maybe that's the point. Shajar al-Durr was never meant to be a comfortable figure. She bent an empire to her will, then disappeared into the very shadows she once ruled from. Her tomb, half palace, half puzzle, reflects the duality of a woman who defied the shape history demanded of her. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She asked to be remembered on her own terms. But while Shajar was obsessed with visibility and reputation, the next royal buried himself in style fusion, rejecting sacred tradition in favor of architectural rebellion. A Tsar who wanted his tomb to reflect not just his beliefs, but a grand, controversial vision of a hybrid empire. Tsar Peter the Great, Russia. Tsar Peter the Great was not a man bound by tradition. He was the kind of ruler who looked at centuries of religious doctrine, ceremonial protocol, and national identity and decided they were all negotiable. Optional, even, sometimes just inconvenient. So when it came to his burial, Peter didn't suddenly develop a pious respect for custom. Instead, he did what he had always done. He built something new, made it strange, and made it his. Peter's reign, 1682–1725, was a full-body collision between Russia and modernity. He dragged the country sometimes screaming into the European Enlightenment. He introduced new calendars, new alphabets, new court fashions, new naval fleets. He shaved the beards off his nobles. He forced them to dance to Western music in gilded halls. He moved the capital from ancient Moscow to a swamp he turned into St. Petersburg, a city he saw as a window to Europe and which others saw as a monument to hubris. But Peter's greatest obsession was not just Europe or progress or war. It was legacy. He didn't want to just be a reformer. He wanted to be the beginning of something, a symbol of Russia's rebirth. So when death approached, slow and painful, thanks to years of illness and a famously stubborn refusal to rest, Peter made one final symbolic break with the past. He rejected the traditional burial site of Russian Tsars, the Archangel Cathedral in the Kremlin, where his royal ancestors had been interred for centuries, under the watchful eye of Russian Orthodoxy. Instead, he chose something scandalous, a new cathedral in a new city, built with new values. Peter ordered his burial to take place in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, which he had commissioned just years earlier inside the walls of the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg. At first glance, the cathedral doesn't seem revolutionary. It has a gilded spire, Baroque stylings, and Orthodox crosses. But look closer, and you'll see what outraged the religious establishment. This cathedral was Western in design, blending Dutch and German architectural motifs with Orthodox elements, a visual statement that Russia was no longer isolated, that it now belonged to the broader European world, that the line between East and West was no longer so rigid. In other words, Peter chose to be buried in a building that embodied his ideology, not his religion. The cathedral's iconostasis, the sacred screen separating the altar from the congregation, was unusually open. The walls were flooded with light. The space was bright, open, and theatrical. To Orthodox eyes, it was jarringly unorthodox, even borderline sacrilegious. But to Peter, it was perfect. His tomb would not be a place of mourning. It would be a stage for the new Russia. And like everything Peter did, the burial came with contradictions. When he died in 1725, the funeral was an odd mix of Orthodox rites, military honors, Enlightenment gestures, and political messaging. His body was placed in a white coffin, dressed in a naval uniform, the symbol of the navy he had personally built from nothing. Soldiers stood guard, priests muttered prayers, foreign dignitaries whispered, unsure what they were witnessing. The Tsar, who had tried to westernize everything, was being buried like no Russian Tsar before him. And then came the long delay. The Peter and Paul Cathedral, though mostly complete, was not quite finished when Peter died. His coffin was temporarily stored in a side chapel for months, not an uncommon practice in royal Europe, but in Russia, it symbolized something else. Peter's refusal to follow anyone else's timeline. Even in death, the man refused to be hurried. Eventually, his remains were moved to the completed nave. A white marble tomb was placed over his body, simple but striking, inscribed with Cyrillic script and decorated with imperial symbols. Over time, the cathedral would become the resting place of nearly every subsequent Romanov, including Catherine the Great, Nicholas II, and the entire line up to the fall of the dynasty. What Peter began as a personal rebellion became a national tradition. Today, tourists walk past the tombs beneath the golden spire, listening to tour guides explain the legacy of reform and brutality, vision and violence. But Peter's own tomb is strangely modest, a sharp contrast to the man's personality. No grand statue, no flaming torch, just marble, light, and silence. And maybe that was the final twist. Peter didn't need a dramatic tomb. He had built his mausoleum in stone and river, in city and legacy. Petersburg itself is the real monument, a city founded by a man who wanted to change everything, including the way Russia buried its kings. But if Peter wanted heaven and empire to meet through architecture, the next king aimed even higher, aligning his grave with the constellations themselves, as if the stars might still answer when his name was spoken underground. King Sejong the Great, Korea. Among the long lineage of Korea's monarchs, King Sejong the Great stands apart not because he demanded grandeur and death, but because he insisted on harmony. Not the decorative kind with gold and incense and sculpted lions, but the cosmic kind, the kind where planets, earth, and spirit fall into place like gears in a divine mechanism. If most rulers plan their burial to guard their memory, Sejong planned his to balance the universe. He ruled from 1418 to 1450 in the heart of the Joseon dynasty, and is remembered less as a conqueror and more as a philosopher king. Sejong was the monarch who gave Korea its written language, Hangul, a script designed not for scribes and scholars, but for farmers, mothers, and ordinary people. He was a scientist of governance, an emperor who dabbled in everything from music theory to astronomy to flood control, a Confucian idealist with the heart of a cosmologist. So, naturally, when it came to his burial, Sejong didn't just want to rest peacefully. He wanted to rest in a place where heaven and earth met in equilibrium. And that place had to be precise. Sejong's tomb, known as Yongnyeong, isn't buried beneath a towering pyramid or hidden behind booby-trapped doors. It sits quietly in Yeoju, surrounded by grass and pine, nestled in a subtle curve of the landscape that feels more organic than constructed. But don't be fooled. Every inch of the site is meticulously calculated based on Pungsu Jiri, Korean geomancy, astronomy, and Confucian spatial logic. In Sejong's worldview, death wasn't just a spiritual passage, it was a form of alignment. If the body wasn't laid to rest properly, in accordance with the stars and the land, then chaos would follow not just for the individual, but for the dynasty, the people, and even the heavens. So he chose a burial site where the tomb would be positioned in relation to constellations, most notably the Big Dipper, which played a key role in East Asian cosmology as a celestial guide for the soul. The surrounding topography had to flow like water and wind, with the mountain behind the tomb offering protection and spiritual anchoring, while the lower land in front allowed the qi, or energy, to disperse gently outward into the kingdom. The tomb itself follows the traditional style, a rounded mound of earth on a raised stone platform, guarded by statues of civil and military officials, stone tigers and sheep, and stone lanterns that symbolize light in the afterlife. But beneath the serenity lies a subterranean logic. The burial chamber is aligned to the cardinal points, the walls reinforced with materials thought to balance elemental forces: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. In short, Sejong didn't build a tomb, he composed a cosmic equation. And he wasn't buried alone. His wife, Queen Sohyeon, is buried beside him, not in a separate hill, but in twin mounds connected by a shared ritual space. The tomb of a king and queen designed not in hierarchy, but in parallel. Their spirits, according to tradition, rise together in the celestial dance that mirrors their earthly bond. This emphasis on symmetry, natural flow, and star-aligned geometry may sound poetic, even quaint. But to Sejong, it was governance. The same mind that designed Korea's alphabet and its water clocks believed that where you lie in death determines how the world remembers you and how the kingdom survives you. And survive it did. Even during the Japanese occupation of Korea in the 20th century, when many royal tombs were looted or damaged, Yongnyeong remained largely intact, perhaps protected more by reverence than force. Locals still visit. Pilgrims still leave handwritten notes in Hangul, thanking Sejong for his gift of language. School children tour the site, walking silently through the pine trees as if entering a classroom made of wind. There are no grand towers, no rivers of mercury, no guards buried alive, just geometry, ritual, and stillness. And in that stillness, something unsettling. The quiet confidence of a king who believed that order could outlast death. But not all emperors trusted harmony to protect them. Some didn't even trust the living. The next royal on our list died mysteriously, was buried in secret, and was only reinterred decades later, possibly just as he predicted. Because some rulers don't fear death, they fear what happens to their legacy when no one's looking. Haile Selassie, Ethiopia. Few royal figures in modern history have been so thoroughly mythologized, misrepresented, and politically recycled as Haile Selassie, the last emperor of Ethiopia. Revered as a messiah by some, reviled as an autocrat by others, Selassie lived and died under a cloud of reverence and suspicion, and the treatment of his body after death reflects that eerie ambiguity. His life was marked by grandeur, exile, return, and symbolic authority on a global stage. His death, by contrast, was defined by absence. And his burial, well, that took decades. Born Tafari Makonnen in 1892, he rose through the imperial ranks and was crowned emperor in 1930. He styled himself as the 225th monarch in a line said to descend from the biblical union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. In other words, Selassie didn't just claim earthly rule, he claimed divine lineage. And for millions of followers across Ethiopia and the global Rastafarian movement, he wasn't just a monarch, he was a living god. But gods, like kings, are not immune to coups. In 1974, after a series of famines, uprisings, and mounting discontent, Haile Selassie was overthrown by a Marxist-Leninist military junta known as the Durr. The revolutionaries promised modern governance, land reform, and an end to imperial excess. What they delivered was a wave of purges, political executions, and one of the most repressive regimes in modern African history. As for Selassie, he was quietly placed under house arrest in the Grand Palace. Officially, he died of natural causes in August 1975. The government claimed heart failure, but no one believed it. To this day, the details surrounding Selassie's death remain murky. Was he smothered in his bed, poisoned, left to wither in isolation? The truth has never been proven. No public autopsy was conducted. No immediate funeral held. In fact, there was no burial at all. His body simply disappeared. Rumors spread fast that his remains had been hidden beneath a palace floor, or thrown into an unmarked grave, or preserved in secret for some future moment of restoration. The Durr, obsessed with severing the past, did everything they could to suppress his memory, renaming streets, rewriting textbooks, and refusing any form of public mourning. And yet, the people whispered. Priests held clandestine prayers. Loyalists recited blessings under their breath. Rastafarian pilgrims came from Jamaica and beyond, convinced that Selassie had not died, but gone into hiding or ascended. The Durr collapsed in 1991, leaving behind a legacy of blood and silence. That same year, during renovations to the Imperial Palace, construction workers uncovered human remains buried under a latrine. They were wrapped hastily, positioned awkwardly, and hidden with deliberate intent. Testing confirmed what many had suspected. They were Haile Selassie's. It would take another 9 years before he received the funeral he had long been denied. In 2025 years after his death, Haile Selassie was finally buried with full imperial honors in Addis Ababa's Holy Trinity Cathedral. The ceremony was a national reckoning. Thousands gathered in silence. Former rebels, priests, international dignitaries, and common citizens watched as a casket draped in the Ethiopian flag was carried to its final resting place, accompanied by chants, incense, and the haunting tones of ancient liturgy. For many, it wasn't just a burial, it was an exorcism. But here's the strange part. Some believe he foresaw all of it. According to oral traditions and unofficial diaries, Selassie had spoken often about how not to be buried. He allegedly warned that his enemies would try to erase him and that his bones might be hidden. But, he said, the truth will return to the surface. Some even claim he instructed loyal priests to prepare for the day his remains would be rediscovered, and that the proper burial rites should not be performed until the world was ready. Whether these claims are true or just a posthumous myth, they've only added to the fog that swirls around his death. Because Selassie's tomb is not just a grave, it's a memory vault, sealed with historical trauma, political theatre, and the kind of mystery that keeps people coming back with more questions than answers. He was buried decades late, and yet, somehow, right on time. And while his memory was once entombed beneath a dictatorship, the next royal on our list was buried under a parking lot, with a reputation so twisted by myth that even the truth when finally unearthed couldn't quite shake the curse. King Richard III, England. If Haile Selassie vanished into silence and myth before returning in regal ceremony, King Richard III took the opposite path, buried in shame, erased from dignity, and rediscovered centuries later beneath a parking lot. That's not a metaphor. That's a municipal tragedy with a royal twist. Richard III's burial story is one of history's greatest reversals. A king who ruled for just 2 years, vilified for centuries as a twisted, murderous usurper, and then, 527 years after his death, found buried under a slab of asphalt behind a social services office in Leicester. But to understand how he got there, you first need to understand who he was and what he meant. Richard Plantagenet, Duke of Gloucester, became King Richard III in 1483 after a flurry of political chess moves and a cloud of suspicion. His brother, King Edward IV, died suddenly, leaving 2 young sons heirs to the throne. Richard was named Lord Protector. Days later, the boys disappeared from the Tower of London, never to be seen again. History would not be kind to him after that. Whether or not Richard murdered his nephews, the princes in the Tower, remains one of England's most enduring cold cases. What's certain is that by the time he faced Henry Tudor's army at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Richard was already viewed as a villain, hunchbacked, power-mad, cursed. Shakespeare would later enshrine him as a deformed tyrant who offers his kingdom for a horse in a final, desperate plea. He lost the battle, the throne, and his life in a single afternoon. Accounts say he fought bravely, charging directly at Henry Tudor, but was surrounded and killed. His body was stripped, slung over a horse, and brought to Leicester, where it was hastily buried in the Greyfriars Priory, a Franciscan friary. No royal ceremony, no monumental tomb. Just a rushed burial with minimal dignity, overseen by men more interested in ending a dynasty than honouring one. Within decades, the friary was destroyed during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries. The site was razed, the memory of Richard's grave faded. Over time, the location of his body was lost, absorbed by the expanding city, built over by brick and bureaucracy. And there he stayed, not under marble, not beneath stained glass, but beneath a city parking lot, wedged between modernity and myth. Centuries passed. Richard's name survived mostly through literature and folklore. He was a footnote king, defined by accusation and theatrical villainy. His defenders, small but passionate, insisted he had been maligned by Tudor propaganda, that he had been a reformer, a man of law, that he had deserved better. Then came 2012. And a team of amateur historians and archaeologists who believed they had pinpointed the likely location of the old friary. They began a small excavation in a municipal car park. No one really expected much. What they found changed history. On the very first day of digging, they uncovered a human skeleton, male, mid-32nd, wounds consistent with a battlefield death. Spinal curvature scoliosis, Not a hunchback, but enough to explain centuries of exaggerated description. The bones matched historical descriptions. Radiocarbon dating fit. DNA was extracted and compared to a living descendant of Richard's sister. The match was undeniable. They had found Richard III. The rediscovery launched a media frenzy. Suddenly, Richard was back in the public imagination, not as a monster, but as a man. His life, death, and burial were re-examined. The debate between Tudor narrative and Ricardian revisionism roared back to life. But now there was a new problem. What to do with the body? Arguments broke out. Some wanted him reburied in York, a city he loved. Others insisted on Westminster Abbey among kings. Eventually, a compromise was reached. He would be laid to rest in Leicester Cathedral, near the site of his original grave, but this time with the honour he never received. In 2015, Richard III was buried again, this time with full state ceremony. Royal family members attended, clergy officiated. Thousands lined the streets to watch the procession. His coffin, made of oak and lead, was carried by pallbearers in silence, the same body that had once been slung like a trophy after defeat now cradled in reverence. And yet, even this ending had its dissonance. Because while Richard was reburied with dignity, the question of what he wanted remains murky. There's no clear record of his wishes, no final will describing his desired resting place. Some believe he wanted to be buried in York Minster. Others argue he wouldn't have imagined a future where it even mattered. Perhaps, in some poetic way, being buried beneath the asphalt for half a millennium was a kind of karmic balance, a grim joke from history on a king remembered more for a play than a policy. And while Richard's bones were lost and found again, the next ruler on our list never got buried at all, at least not properly. Instead, his remains were swallowed by a river, clad in golden armour, vanishing into legend with one last, desperate demand.